Welcome to Next Gen DFIR, Mass Exploits and Supplier Compromises. Criminals have started targeting suppliers and also leveraging zero-day vulnerabilities in order to break into systems worldwide. And this is not an isolated incident. This has become the new norm as criminals realize that they can maximize their return on investment, and by hacking into a relatively small number of systems, they can spread malware and gain unauthorized access on a wide scale. So today we're going to talk about how incident response needs to change, and we all need to adapt to this new norm. My name is Sherri Davidoff. I'm the CEO of LMG Security. You may also know me as Alien from the book Breaking and Entering. I have a degree in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT, and I'm a GCFA and GPen.
And my name is Matt Durrin. I am the IR team lead for LMG Security, a senior security consultant, certified forensics examiner, and head of R&D.
Together with our colleague Karen Springer, we have a new book coming out on ransomware and cyber extortion. So check it out. It should be out by the end of this year. Today, we're going to start off by talking about why we need to adapt our incident response processes and how the attackers' tactics are changing. We'll use SolarWinds as an example and step through that to discuss our new checklist and things that you need to include in your incident response processes. Then we're going to flip over to a zero-day exploit and analyze the Microsoft Exchange zero-day vulnerability that was announced in early 2020. And finally, we're going to dig into the Kaseya attacks and apply our new checklist to this recent hack. Along the way, we're going to talk about how incident response needs to evolve, and we'll leave you at the end with that checklist that you can use. So, of course, recently we saw in the news that Kaseya was hacked. Kaseya, of course, is remote management and monitoring software that's used by enterprises and also managed service providers to gain remote access to networks around the world. Multiple zero-day exploits were discovered back in April, and hackers were able to exploit those in July. The Revil ransomware gang and an affiliate of that deployed ransomware to at least 1,500 organizations that we know of. This is the largest ransomware attack on record. So again, this is just another of the recent mass zero days and supply chain exploitations that we've seen, from SolarWinds to Blackbaud to Microsoft Exchange to Accellion and many, many more. And even though these are slightly different types of incidents, our response will have many similarities. So there's some debate over whether something like the Kaseya RMM exploit counts as a supply chain attack. So we like to summarize it in this way. Supply chain attacks are where the vector is through a third-party technology vendor, whereas a mass zero-day exploit is when the exploitation occurs after the software is already deployed in the victim environment. And again, the response is surprisingly similar, as we'll see. Let's take SolarWinds as our first example. We're going to dissect this. So FireEye announced that they had suffered a supply chain malware infection in December of 2020. So they had been hacked, some of their offensive tools were leaked, and they notified the public. Now, they were able to trace this back to a backdoor in the SolarWinds platform. Their Orion network monitoring software is widely used by organizations around the world. And the unfortunate thing is that this meant that criminals had installed a backdoor to approximately 18,000 customer networks. Now, SolarWinds had been hacked since 2019, September of 2019. And this was a little bit shocking because, again, the first time that this was publicized was in December of 2020. So think about, how does your response team find out about a supply chain attack? In the case of SolarWinds, the criminals went hands-on to the SolarWinds network and did some test deployment of code starting in the fall of 2019. By March, they had actually rolled out that backdoor into the platform and customers started to install it. The code was properly signed by SolarWinds, and so there was really nothing to indicate that there was a problem. Shortly thereafter, the criminals started actually reaching out into customer networks and interacting with customer networks, gaining hands-on access to their enterprises as well. Again, it was still many months before any customer that we know of detected this and publicly reported it. And FireEye, one of their customers, was actually the first to announce it, not the vendor themselves, which has some implications for our threat intelligence. You may be looking for notifications from your vendors, when really the notifications may come from a different third party. And you also have to think about how much can you trust those notifications. So we need to be monitoring threat intelligence platforms. So identify your key software products and suppliers. What do you need to be monitoring? What announcements do you need to be watching for. And then set up your threat intelligence sources. So think about receiving vendor alerts, following your vendors on Twitter, things like that. It's actually very effective, even though it's low tech. Also, you can subscribe to various threat intelligence platforms. There's commercial options. You can also follow security vendors, Critical Stack, CrowdStrike, and others. Academic organizations and security training companies like SANS are very good at announcing these. Also, government agencies tend to circulate this type of news.
This is the Carbon Black Threat Research Center, which is a community-driven threat research repository offered by the VMware Carbon Black company. We use them a lot when we're responding to incidents, and it's a great place to find updates and indicators of compromise for new and upcoming cyber attacks before they really hit any of the mainstream media feeds.
Also, think about whether your suppliers are also monitoring for threat intelligence. What software do they rely on that is then deployed to you or that affects your risk? The next thing you need to do once you hear about an alert involving a vendor that relates to you is you need to evaluate your risk. So in the case of SolarWinds, we found out early on what versions of their software were affected, but it still wasn't trivial to figure out exactly who was impacted. Some organizations were running that version of the software. Others had never patched or never upgraded. And in fact, we found organizations that had been very slow and didn't keep their software up to date weren't impacted by this issue, so they kind of dodged a bullet. But I'm not sure we really need an incentive to not apply patches.
Yeah, again, we don't want to recommend skipping security patches on your systems, but in this case, it did save a few people.
Yeah. In some cases, you also need to think about the window of compromise. So, were you running an affected version during that period of compromise? You might need to look at your change management logs. Now, what do you do if you're not sure? Again, often in these early phases, you may not be certain if you're impacted, and we need to take quick action with very little information. So talk ahead of time about whether or not you should take down software that might be impacted and what the balance is between taking action versus keeping things online. You also want to coordinate with your suppliers. If there's a supplier running software on your behalf, ask them ahead of time, how will you react? When will you get notified? Will they be changing your software on the fly or coordinating with you? One new tool that we have in our arsenal is a software bill of materials, SBOM. So recently there was an executive order from the White House, and one of the things that was required was a software bill of materials for any suppliers that do business with the government. And we do anticipate that this will trickle down to the public sooner or later. So that means that any software you rely on or suppliers may have to produce a list of software that they rely on. Now this is going to become part of our incident response processes over the next few years, because you will have if this comes to pass, you may have the ability to review those SBOMs when there's an announcement to determine what your risk is of downstream compromise because of software that your vendors are relying on. So stay tuned. We do expect to see incident response practices evolving and taking into account increased availability of software bills of materials. All right, so let's get back to SolarWinds. So in the case of SolarWinds, we want to evaluate our risk and what is the risk of a potential data breach or widespread attack or a lurking piece of malware within our network. Well, unfortunately, it was very high. Once the SolarWinds adversary had access to customer networks, they could really do whatever they wanted. So they could steal files, they could install new software, they could gather information about your network, disable security tools. We saw a lot of evasive behavior. They were deliberately trying to avoid detection, and that's why they were so successful. So there was a very high risk of a breach. The good thing is that in the government advisory, the CISA advisory, they specifically said, hey, you're going to want to forensically image system memory and or host operating systems if you have that capability. So remember, when there's a risk of a breach, you probably want to pull in your cyber insurer, your breach coach, your forensics team, and really think about preserving that evidence.
In a lot of these cases, especially with a 0-day or a supplier compromise, we have to act quickly with very, very little information about what is actually happening with the system. Advisories and early information can help, but it's usually largely incomplete data. So we go with standard options. If we're going for the nuclear option, we can yank the power cable, we can yank the network cable, and then as kind of a general step, we want to do system-wide password resets. But there are impacts that we need to be concerned with. Are there going to be operational impacts to the organization if we take this service offline? Are there going to be help desk calls? Is the help desk department going to be overwhelmed by tech support? Now, pulling a plug on SolarWinds, unfortunately, might not have saved people who were impacted directly by this vulnerability. SolarWinds was a multi-component attack. The original backdoor was in the SolarWinds software, but the attackers rarely stayed within that system. They would move laterally into other systems, and in most cases, we saw them deploying things like Cobalt Strike beacons. These were used for both lateral movement and for persistence inside of the network. So, taking the SolarWinds server offline was great, but if they had a beacon or some other means of accessing the network, it was a little too late at that point to really rely on that. And Cobalt Strike is something we're seeing in a lot of new adversary attacks. I mean, it's become a very, very common occurrence, especially in ransomware and system compromise, to see these legitimate tools being used by malicious actors.
Yeah, that's a recurring theme.
So that brings up our very important next point. Threat hunting needs to be included in everyone's IR plans. This needs to be standard operating procedure for any kind of malicious or remediation activities that are taking place. We tend to use Carbon Black when we do our incident response, and here's an example of that. This is an example of us finding a Cobalt Strike beacon dropper being executed on the network, and that's executing using PowerShell and a base64 encoded command. This is something that is kind of a hallmark for a lot of malicious activity. We'll see it when we talk about Exchange as well. But knowing this ahead of time means that we need to be careful. There are other pieces of the network that may use the exact same tactics and procedures that the malicious adversaries are using that may or may not be malicious at all. A good example of that is, well, Ansible. So in a couple of the networks we were working with, we're actively looking for these Cobalt Strike beacon payloads. And again, that's a PowerShell command running a base64 encoded string that then acts to install the beacon. Ansible functions in a very, very similar way for network automation. So if we're taking steps to block encoded PowerShell usage, we could also be breaking a critical component of the system at the same time. Again, not a new tactic, but something that, especially with these newer kinds of attacks and the sophistication of networks that we're working with, we need to be very, very cognizant of as we move forward with response.
So I think this really gets to the point you need to be prepared to do threat hunting. So have the tools in place that you're going to want to use and understand what you're going to be looking for to avoid these false positives, or be prepared to pull in a third party if necessary.
That's totally right. So the next thing we want to think about, since we are going to be doing threat hunting, is how do we do that effectively in one of these new types of cyber attacks, something that we know very little about. First, we need to obtain the indicators of compromise that we have available for us when these first break out. Now, in the case of SolarWinds, we had indicators of compromise provided by both FireEye and Microsoft very, very early in the outbreak. They were two of the more highly impacted organizations that were public about it anyway.
And those were pretty reliable indicators of compromise, so we were lucky in that respect.
Exactly. We could trust the data we were getting from them. We also had some good indicators of compromise provided by the U.S. government from CISA. They offered things like hash values, specific pieces of behavioral activity to look for. It was very good. Other times you can look for the vendor. The vendor may release these assisting guides to help you hunt for these malicious infections inside your network. Next, security firms and researchers are usually a pretty good resource, although we do have to vet those a little bit more carefully because really anyone can put up a blog post. And then threat hunting and intelligence software. So things like Carbon Black. What you see on the screen here is a list out of the watch list. They're available through the Carbon Black EDR toolkit. And they are subscription feeds that are regularly updated that we can use to assist in these threat hunts. So things like US Cybercom, AMSI, built-in MITRE ATT&CK framework notifications are really helpful here. There's also open source threat intelligence projects like MISP. MISP is a very good source of community-driven information that can be used and directly integrated into a lot of IDS systems. So definitely something to watch out for. And then also structured formats for these are really good to be familiar with. So if you're not familiar with Yara or Styx, take a little bit of time, get familiar with it. They can be incredibly useful for quickly identifying indicators of compromise on your network without having to sift through a lot of superfluous data.
Now, if you want to have an effective response, you're not going to be able to assemble these on the fly in the heat of the moment and have a really effective threat hunting campaign. So again, you want to understand ahead of time where you're going to get your indicators of compromise and make sure that they're sources you can trust. So in this case, one of the challenges was that this was a nation-state attack. So there are sources of evidence that indicate this was Nobelium, which is a Russian state-sponsored hacker. Microsoft believes that over 1,000 developers contributed to that SolarWinds attack. 44% of the organizations impacted by this were themselves information technology companies. And I find that particularly scary because it means that the criminals, the adversary, could have gotten into not just SolarWinds and their customers, but then customers of those customers. So we anticipate that there will be ripple effects from this, creating risk throughout the entire technology ecosystem for years to come.
Now, one of the things that made SolarWinds particularly difficult to analyze, especially at first, was how difficult it was to actually obtain indicators of compromise from networks that were not actively experiencing an infection from the Sunburst malware at the time. Sunburst malware was specifically designed to evade detection and analysis, so they employed things like a 12 to 14-day sleep timer, verifications of very, very specific SolarWinds DLL names before the software would execute, random delays in execution, which made sandboxing incredibly difficult, multiple domain checks, and then security analysis and software checks. Again, they designed this to not be analyzed, and it made it very, very difficult at first for individuals to obtain these indicators of compromise unless they had direct access to this running in the wild.
Again, this is our new norm.
It is.
So responders should expect those IOCs to be updated throughout your response. The initial IOCs that you receive are probably just going to be a small subset of the ones that exist in the long term. So you want to constantly get updates and be checking regularly. 12 to 14 days is a pretty long period of time.
We're also seeing things like heavy decoy traffic being used in pretty much every new piece of malware. We're seeing banking Trojans specifically are really bad about this. Basically, what this means is the malware is going to generate its own malicious outbound traffic that it's sending out to its own C2 servers, but at the same time, it's going to generate almost identical traffic that it's going to send out to a bunch of legitimate sources, things like jQuery, Google, GStatic, one tech company, Facebook, Yahoo. The list is very, very long here, but again, it obscures that outbound traffic and makes it very difficult to find unless you're specifically looking for it.
Okay, so our next step after you hunt for threats, or while you're hunting for threats, is you need to consider applying emergency patches and software updates. So when you have a supplier like SolarWinds that has an issue with their software, they issued multiple patches to deal with it. And again, there wasn't even a patch for this when it was first announced. So you can see that the first patch was released December 23rd of 2020, and there were 3 patches released on that day. Another one was released in late January, and 2 more were released in February. So as responders, you need to be aware of the fact that there will be emergency patches, but they may not exist right away, and so you need to have workarounds. If they do exist, they may not fully solve the problem. They may be just a partial solution, so you still need to take some other steps to reduce your risk and deal with it. Sometimes new patches can break things, and that's a real balancing act. We do need patches, Matt. Plan for elevated risks longer term. This goes for you as well as any suppliers that may have been impacted. So again, SolarWinds has now been hacked. We know that. And organizations that were leveraging their software, many of them have been hacked as well. The result of this is that hackers may have extensive data that they can leverage to launch future attacks. That could include employee emails, internal sensitive information, passwords, keys, and more. So this affects the risk of our entire software ecosystem that relies on that one supplier. We've also seen the installation of advanced persistent threats and additional malware, as Matt alluded to. Criminals may also have obtained software source code and vulnerability details. That's something fairly common, and then they can leverage that in future attacks. If an MSP is hacked, you might see customer lists that get stolen, or software providers as well, and then again, the criminals can go after them. So remember, this doesn't just apply to suppliers that are in the news. In many cases, suppliers may have been hacked and not detected it, or may have been hacked and not reported it because there weren't any laws or contractual obligations in place at the time that required that level of reporting. So here's our checklist. When we analyze the SolarWinds attack, here are 7 things that we need to think about integrating into modern incident response processes. So number 1, we need to be proactively monitoring threat intelligence for the tools that we rely on. You also need to have someone assigned to capture this information and evaluate the risk when a new risk is announced. You need to consider preserving forensic evidence even before you step up to contain the damage. And then threat hunting needs to be included in all of our response processes. It just needs to be part of our new norm. Also, expect emergency patches and emergency updates and have those conversations in advance about whether or not you want to apply them. And finally, plan for elevated risks that pertain to either your organization or your supplier. All right, now that we've analyzed a supply chain attack, let's talk about how these same tactics apply to a mass zero-day vulnerability. And a great example of this is the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability that was announced in the first quarter of 2020. So of course, Microsoft announced on March 2nd, 2021. Microsoft announced on March 2nd that there were zero-day vulnerabilities in the Microsoft Exchange software that many organizations around the world use to host email. And they released those security updates. But even before they released them, organizations around the world had been hacked. Now, the adversary behind this was linked to Chinese state-sponsored hackers, the Hafnium group. So again, we saw some very advanced tactics deployed. By March 5th, we knew that at least 30,000 organizations were already hacked. And when your email gets hacked, you may have a major data breach on your hands or other fallout as a result of that. Email is very sensitive. So what could the hackers do in this case? Well, by exploiting these vulnerabilities, they could gain full administrative control over this server. They could steal your email. They could steal credentials. They could install more malware and pivot into your organization's network and infect other computers. So this was a very high-risk situation. Now, how do we as responders find out about it? Well, this is an interesting case to analyze. We know that researchers discovered the vulnerabilities on January 5th, 2021 and alerted Microsoft. Microsoft actually responded fairly quickly compared to many suppliers. They clearly jumped on this and worked hard to create patches, but unfortunately the release did not happen quickly enough for many of their customers. On February 23rd, Microsoft shared information about the attack with some of their partners. And on February 26th, 3 days later, attackers started to exploit it. Now, the public was not yet aware of this. So literally before most people even found out about it, many Exchange servers were already hacked. Most people found out on March 2nd when Microsoft released patches, but it was already too late by then. And the next day, tens of thousands of Exchange servers were already compromised. So unless you were right on top of that and installed the patches right away, chances are pretty good that you were already compromised in some form or fashion. And even then, it might have been too late.
So it's interesting to think about how that exploit actually got leaked out into the the hacker's sphere. DevCore, the pen testing group that actually discovered the vulnerability, kept things pretty tight-lipped. But one of their testers, who went by the name Orange Sai, noticed that the code that was being used by the adversaries in this case looked very, very similar to the code he had submitted to actually report the exploit to Microsoft, up to and including the fact that the web shell password Orange that he had hard-coded into his exploit was being used by hackers in the wild. So it got out somehow. We're just not quite sure how.
Yeah, so one of the things that people have been wondering about is, was this leaked through Microsoft Active Protection Program? So this is a method where Microsoft partners, key partners, get a heads up about upcoming patches and vulnerabilities so that they can prepare and support their customers. Unfortunately, a small number of people may be able to keep a secret, but can 82? Possibly not. Now, Microsoft warns that if a MAP partner was the source of the leak, they would face consequences. Unfortunately, think about the attack surface here. If any one of those partners had an email hack or some kind of compromise, criminals might be able to steal information about these upcoming exploits and patches. So, and this is something that hackers are really targeting. So that's something to consider, is how that information gets distributed. We know that historically, hackers are actually very interested in bug information and source codes so that they can find vulnerabilities and exploit known issues. For example, and we also know that we don't necessarily get a heads up about these. So for example, Microsoft's bug tracking database was hacked in 2013, but the public didn't find out about that for 4 years. 4 years later, in 2017, this finally hit the news. And chances are pretty good that many other technology vendors have had similar issues where their networks have been hacked, maybe their source code has been accessed, or their bug tracking database has been accessed, and either they haven't detected that or they haven't reported it because there's no legal or contractual obligation at that time for that particular firm. Researchers may also be targeted, and many researchers are not deploying security technologies or staff that could rival nation-state attacks. So again, we have to think about the fact that bugs, vulnerabilities, all of this information may fall into the wrong hands before customers or the public have a chance to respond.
All right, so with Exchange, how did he know if you were affected by the Exchange zero-day attack? Well, Unfortunately, if you were running Microsoft Exchange in an on-premise server and it connected out to the public internet, there's a really good chance that you were affected by this in one form or another. This means that all the email data on the server and user data on the server is potentially at risk. Now, the vulnerable code that was exploited in this particular outbreak had been in place for over 10 years in the Exchange code base. For those who are counting, that means it's been out since at least 2011. And this affected versions 2010, 2013, 2016, 2019, the entire fleet of Exchange products. Now, once these exploits became public, what we saw was a mass seeding event. This meant that every hacker on the planet who now wanted to exploit these probably did. And this was going out to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of active servers all across the country. We were seeing organizations being, or at least attempting to be compromised by multiple threat actors at the same time. And really all you had to do was go onto something like Shodan and look for Exchange servers, and that would give you your attack list. And it was a reasonably simple exploit to execute. Everything was pre-scripted, so these adversaries became very, very aggressive with their tactics and how to break into these servers. So again, in response, we had to start with forensics preservation, and this needs to be one of the very first things that we think about. It's often a time-consuming process. Nobody wants to stop and do it, but it's incredibly important. So first, we need to forensically image all of our Exchange servers. We need to obtain the volatile memory, too, because we want to know active network connections and active programs that were running on the computer when this actually happened. And we want to preserve our network and IIS logs. This is really important because it's a potential business email compromise, and business email compromises are serious business. There is a lot of sensitive information in email. There's a lot of recon information. These are future target lists. It's potential financial information, medical information, personal information, a lot of stuff in there that we don't want getting out. We then needed to go through and do a check for unauthorized access. So we needed to see if the server was affected, and if so, how deep that access went. And then we could determine the risk of both email access and acquisition and network compromise.
According to the FBI, business email compromise cases were the root of $1.8 billion in cash losses last year. So the dollar amount is high, and the risk of a breach is high as well, which is why we saw Microsoft customers like the European Banking Authority announcing breaches, and there was a lot of fallout to this.
Yeah, there certainly was. Next, just like SolarWinds, we need to contain the damage. So we need to act, yesterday on these things.
Literally.
We cannot leave these servers online if they're that vulnerable to exploit.
Everybody.
Yeah, exactly. So CISA and Microsoft released guidance for the proxy logon remediation, which was very helpful at first to get things offline. But again, we didn't know a ton about how exactly this was happening when it happened. So we have our standard options, yank the power cable and yank the network connection of your company's Exchange server. So let's keep that one in mind. And then in this case, because we knew a couple of the TTPs that were being used by the adversaries in this case, we knew that a domain-wide password reset was likely one of the very, very first things we wanted to do. We could see them using procdump to capture passwords and harvest credentials. But again, there are some major impacts that we need to consider before any actions are taken. This is your Exchange server, so your email might be down. How does that affect your organization? Again, help desk calls, evidence destruction, and operational impact all need to be factored into how we respond for these things. Now, this brings into threat hunting one more time. Our primary new goal when we start into incident response is to start threat hunting. Microsoft and CISA published a great list of indicators of compromise right away. Remember, Microsoft actually had a little bit of time to get these things out the door before this really became huge. And we had an example of a financial services firm that we worked with. We dropped Carbon Black onto their network so we could look at their local computer systems and their local network infrastructure. And then we did a very targeted analysis of the IIS logs from their Exchange servers to look for any email system specific activities that might indicate that the company had been actually compromised. And we did this using some known Hafnium behavioral characteristics. And when we were looking, we actually identified literally hundreds of attempts to exploit the vulnerable server. And these were coming from all across the world, likely from multiple different adversary groups. Some were successful, others were not. I think it all depended on the skill level of the adversary that was going after the server at that point in time. But again, it was really eye-opening as to how pervasive this threat actually was. So these are some of the indicators of compromise that we were looking for with the Exchange vulnerability. We were looking for 8-character ASPX files in the inet pub folders. This was an indication that with some specific naming conventions and, of course, the time the shells were installed, that the exploit had actually been successfully used and that there was now a web shell present on the server. We also, again, were looking for encoded PowerShell activity, and there was a lot of that. The problem that we had here was so many people were jumping in to do these investigations on Exchange servers that we had an overwhelming overwhelming amount of community indicators of compromise being provided. And in a lot of cases, those turned out to be false positives. It was people seeing malicious activity where there wasn't any because they were in such a heightened state of alert. So again, we need to vet those things.
It really seemed like everybody and their mom was releasing IOCs, even Chile's bank regulator. And another problem was that the IOCs kept changing. And that was partly because the adversary's tactics kept changing as well. So many different attackers were involved. Ransomware operators started taking advantage of the exchange vulnerabilities. Many others. We even saw law enforcement, which we'll get to in a moment. But again, those IOCs kept evolving, and responders had to keep on top of that.
We did. Here's a good example of another one of the IOCs that we pulled from one of our cases. So this is an encoded PowerShell that we saw, or encoded PowerShell command we saw running in the IIS server. They're invoking a web shell, which is the support with a 0 instead of an O file, and then executing what was later revealed to be a recon attempt to get process information back from the host. And we saw multiple different iterations of these exact types of commands, but they were things that we could key into to determine if the attack was successful and if it was still happening, which was really important to know. We also wanted to look at post-exploit behavior. And the thing I really want to point out here is not just the list of things they were doing, but how they were doing it. So we can see the adversary using things like 7-zip. We can see him using the PSExec toolkit, the sysinternals toolkit from Microsoft. And this is another one of those trends that we're really starting to run into in IR, is that a lot of adversaries, once they reach into a network, are not using custom-designed malware to infect and recover data from your network. They're using commercial toolkits. And a lot of times they're toolkits that the actual environment that they're breaking into uses regularly. So again, that blends into the background and makes it really difficult to tell when something is malicious and when it's not, if it's not clearly defined, like happening at 2 a.m. when the office closes at 5 or something like that. So again, something you really need to watch out for. Now, Microsoft was very helpful in the Exchange zero-day attack and released some very nice scripting that we could use to, one, tell if the server was vulnerable to the compromise, if it had been compromised, and then if we chose to, we could utilize an on-premise mitigation tool to identify and remove the web shells from the environment and kind of cut off that initial point of access. Again, this was automated remediation, but we had to be really careful because this does delete things from the system, and if we're deleting things, we're potentially deleting evidence. From response, again, we need to make sure that we're preserving these things to the best of our ability for that follow-on investigation, because we may need to report a data breach because of it.
Again, we needed to apply emergency patches and updates, and the good thing was that Microsoft was prepared before this was publicly announced. The bad thing was that the patches were not available before many organizations got hacked. And after they announced it, not everybody was ready to immediately patch their Exchange server. If you didn't patch immediately, you were likely hacked. So you want to have these conversations ahead of time and decide, are you going to immediately deploy patches to critical systems when an issue like this occurs, or are you going to be a later adopter? In this case, we also saw law enforcement intervention. So the FBI received a secret court order to hack into, there's no better word for it, to hack into organizations using these same exploits and then remove the web shells. They then attempted to provide notice. They made their best effort. So there are pros and cons to this, right, Matt?
Oh, yeah, of course. I mean, one, I'm sure they had the best intentions. You know, we're from the government and here to help you. But when you have somebody coming into your server and removing these things, a responder doesn't know if this is the FBI or an adversary doing this, so it becomes kind of confusing for them at that point. Also, there's the potential for evidence destruction, and then we look down the road. I mean, is something like this going to happen again? And what are the future implications of this type of activity?
I think this poses unique challenges for investigators as well, because when you're analyzing access logs, it's hard to tell if access is initiated by a government agency or by an adversary, and you may only find out about it days or weeks or months down the road.
Yeah, exactly.
So plan for elevated risks long term. Again, like in the SolarWinds attack, email theft can be very impactful. You may see financial fraud or targeted follow-on attacks, and this could impact your vendor or your organization. Okay, so now that we've gone through our checklist with SolarWinds, the supply chain attack, and with Microsoft Exchange, a mass zero-day vulnerability, let's get back to our recent Kaseya ransomware attacks. First of all, this was announced on the 4th of July weekend that this remote monitoring and management software had a major vulnerability. This happened 4th of July weekend. Was this a coincidence?
Probably not.
Probably not. At LMG, we call Fridays Forensics Friday because so many hackers are deploying ransomware after business hours on a Friday. According to FireEye, 76% of the time, ransomware is executed outside normal work hours. So 27% of the time on the weekends and 49% of the time after hours on weekdays. So think about who is on call for your organization, who's going to be monitoring over 4th of July weekend, and what kind of decisions are they empowered to make. Also, talk with your key suppliers that you rely on. Are your MSPs monitoring threat intelligence? How quickly are they going to notify you, and are they going to take action? MSP communication is absolutely key, as is supplier software vendors communication. Now, in this case, we had some interesting impacts surrounding disclosure, as we often do. So the timeline of the vulnerability detection and notification is as shown here. So the vulnerabilities were detected by the Dutch Institute for Vulnerability Disclosure in early April of 2021. And at that time, they discovered at least 7 vulnerabilities. They pulled a list and discovered at least 2,200 vulnerable systems. And they provided all of this information to the software vendor Kaseya. So that's nice that they were there to support Kaseya, and Kaseya worked very collaboratively with the researchers, according to the research team. Now, the researchers gave them a 90-day timeline on the disclosure, and on April 10th and May 8th, Kaseya released patches for 4 of those vulnerabilities, but the remaining 3 were not slated for actual correction until July. They were working diligently on them, according to the researchers, and they were just about to be released when the attackers struck and took advantage of those. So the timing on that, honestly, is a little bit suspicious, and it should really make us think about, again, who has access to information about those vulnerabilities, because hackers are always looking to take advantage before a patch is released, whenever. Often we have some challenges in communication with suppliers, so you really need to think about what to expect in terms of your communication. Matt, do you want to share an earlier case involving Revil and a managed service provider?
Yeah, of course. In 2019, Revil took over an MSP that serviced dental facilities specifically. This is an MSP out of Colorado. They demanded $700,000 for a master decryptor from the MSP, who initially refused payment. Odds are good they probably paid a little bit farther down the road, but they were very tight-lipped about the entire thing and didn't want to share info. So as a responder, we had a really hard time getting any indicators of compromise or any assistance from the MSP at that point. So again, it brings up a very important point. Do you know what your supplier is going to do? Do you know how they're going to behave in the case that something like this happens? And if not, it probably should be something that you have a discussion with them about.
Yep, exactly. Also, think about where you get your information from. Immediately after the Kaseya attacks, criminals started pretending that they were your partners. So Kaseya came out with a warning and said, watch out, spammers may be making phone calls claiming to be a Kaseya partner reaching out to help. They're also using news about the Kaseya incident to send out fake email notifications that appear to be Kaseya updates. And you can see one of those in the screenshot here, where there's an adversary sending out spam, pretending it's a Microsoft update to protect against ransomware, and it fixes a vulnerability in Kaseya. So never mind that this makes no sense. People do fall for these, or at least click on the link. And if they do, it's a Cobalt Strike installer.
Yeah.
So how do you contain the damage? Again, this is a standard part of our checklist. Unfortunately, in this case, really the main way to contain it right off the bat was to immediately shut down your VSA server. And Kaseya announced this and said it's critical that you do this immediately, because one of the first things the attacker does is shut off administrative access to the VSA.
Yeah.
So you got to proactively do it yourself. Of course, that is not so easy to shut off your remote management software when you're trying to remotely manage your network. So again, a lot of challenges. We also saw them hoping to roll out a patch. Unlike the Microsoft case, the patch was not ready when news of the Kaseya vulnerability emerged, because criminals had taken advantage of it, and it was a ransomware deployment. And when they were attempting to release the patches, they ran into multiple unforeseen delays. So that time frame kept changing. And as we've seen in previous cases, even if the patches do get rolled out, there's no guarantee that they will fully remediate the issue. There could potentially be other vulnerabilities, and you need to understand what is your organization's policy, what's your MSP's policy regarding applying those patches. Do you want to be the guinea pig or not? Okay, so this will happen again. Hackers want the most return on their investment, and they've figured out that if they target widely used software or they target service providers, they can have a widespread impact and get the most bang for their buck. We've also seen that breaches lead to more breaches. So the information and access that the attackers have gained from previous hacks can help them to launch more effective attacks in the future. So be careful. Sorry for the image. Matt, you now owe me a bottle of whiskey. We had a little bet that I couldn't use that image in this presentation. All right. Adapt your DFIR processes. How do we do that? Number one, make sure that you're monitoring threat intelligence, as we talked about. Evaluate your risk. First responders need to be doing this when a new alert comes out. You want to think about conducting forensic preservation. It may not necessarily be important in all cases, but in many cases it is. You have to contain the damage before you have extensive information about the problem, which again is its own challenge. Threat hunting needs to be a regular part of our incident response in these types of cases. Also, emergency patches and updates are going to become the norm in supply chain compromises and these mass zero-day vulnerabilities. And finally, plan for those elevated risks. This is the new norm. My name is Sherri Davidoff.
And I am Matt Durrin.
We are from LMG Security. Check out our upcoming book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion, and our podcast, Breaking Breaches. And drop us a line on LinkedIn if you have any questions.